Peace, peace, black people. Welcome to Yemima's World, the Jelly Moose's Cafe. I am your hostess, Yemima. It is always good to be black in the land of the living once again. The music that you are listening to, I do not own the rights to it. It is Wendieo, a Cherokee morning song, and it is about three generations. Um, we are still in Indigenous Month, Heritage Month, and I've been doing some stories and just giving out some information on our Native American ancestors. And so I thought tonight I've been, giving you a lot of information, but I wanted to I pull, of course, this off of the internet, and I just want to read this. It just kind of gives you an overview of Black uh, Native American or Black Indigenous people in the United States. So, as that's the total population, this is as of this information that I pulled. The total population, my goodness, is about 269,421 that identify it's mixed with African and Native American, and that was according to the 2010 census. The languages that they speak is American English, Louisiana French, Louisiana Creole, Gullah, Tatanese. Ooh, I didn't know that. Okay. Afro Seminole Creole, and then Native American languages, including Navajo, Dakota, Cherokee, Choctaw, Muscovy, and Ojibwe. And the related ethnic groups are African American, Atlantic Creole, Black Seminoles, Louisiana Creole, Brass Ankles, Chestnut Ridge people, Indigenous Peoples of Americas, Mosquito Sambu, Nigatafuna Americans, and Redbone. So Redbone. Do anyone that's listening, do you remember back in the 70s, there was a pop group called Redbone, and they were indigenous or Native American people, and they used to sing this song, "Come and Get Your Love." And back in the day, of course, in the 70s, we used to call fair-skinned people in our neighborhood or in our family, we used to call them a red bone. And so apparently there is a ethnic group called Redbone. I'm going to do some research and see what I can find about that. All right, so look, Black Indians are Native American people. They define as Native American due to being affiliated with Native American communities and being culturally Native American, who has significant African American heritage. Historically, certain Native American tribes have had close relations with African Americans, especially in the regions where slavery was prevalent or where free people of color have historically resided. Now, members of the five civilized tribes, they participated in holding enslaved African Americans in the Southeast, and some enslaved or formerly enslaved people migrated with them to the West on the Trail of Tears in 1830 and later during the period of the Indian removal. And I have some other videos. If you go back and listen to some of my other episodes, I talk about the five civilized tribes, how they became civilized, what makes them civilized, and also that there were Black tears on the Trail of Tears. And then in controversial actions since the late 20th century, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole nations, they tightened their rules for membership. And at times they excluded freedmen who did not have at least one ancestor that was listed as Native American on the early 20th century Dawes Roll. I also talked about the Dawes Roll. There are a lot of white people on the Dawes roll. They paid the government $5. They became $5 Indians. But I find it funny that they didn't say anything about the $5 Indians not being able to be part of the tribe, even though they bought their way into it. But they excluded freedmen from being some freedmen from being a part of it. Um, Now, this exclusion was later appealed in the courts, both because of the treaty conditions and in some cases because of possible inaccuracies in some of the roles. The Chickasaw Nation never extended citizenship to Chickasaw freedmen. That means the Chickasaw Nation may have enslaved Africans and brought them in as family as long as they were working for free. But then, as soon as freedom came, you're no longer family. We don't need you anymore. Until recently, historic relations between Native Americans and African Americans were relatively neglected in mainstream United States history studies. Over time, Africans had varying degrees of contact with Native Americans, although they did not live together in as a great number as with Europeans. Enslaved Africans brought to the United States, as well as their descendants, have had a history of cultural exchange and intermarriage with Native Americans, as well as with other enslaved mixed race persons who had some Native American and European ancestry. Most such interactions took place in New England, where contact was established early, and in the southern United States, where the large number of African descended people were enslaved. In the 21st century, a significant number of African Americans have some Native American ancestry, but most have not grown up with those cultures and lack current social, cultural, or linguistic ties to Native peoples. Relationships among different Native Americans, Africans, and African Americans have been varied and complex. Native peoples often disagree about the role of ethnic African people in their communities. Some tribes or bands were more accepting of ethnic Africans than others and welcomed them as full members of their respective cultures and communities. Other Native Americans saw uses for slavery and did not oppose it for others. Some Native Americans and people of African descent fought alongside one another in armed struggles for resistance against U.S. expansion into Native territories, as in the Seminole Wars in Florida. Now, after the American Civil War, some Africans became or continued as members of the U.S. Army. Many were assigned to fight against Native Americans in the wars in the western frontier states. Their military units became known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a nickname given to them by the Native Americans. And Black Seminole men, in particular, were recruited from Indian Territory to work as Native American scouts for the Army. So, see, we were Native Americans as long as we were helping. And then, when they didn't need us anymore, they discounted us or threw us away. So records of contact between Africans and Native Americans date back to April of 1502, when the first enslaved African arrived in Hispaniola. Some Africans escaped inland from the colony of Santo Domingo. Those who survived and joined with the native tribes became the first group of Black Indians. In the lands which later became part of the United States, the first recorded example of an enslaved African escaping from European colonies and being absorbed by Native American dates back to 1526. Now, in June of that year, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon established a Spanish colony near the mouth of the PD River in present-day South Carolina. The Spanish settlement was named San Miguel de Guadalupe. Its inhabitants included 100 enslaved Africans. And in 1526, the first enslaved African fled the colony and took refuge with the local Native American. So brother went and hid, and they welcomed him. Then in 1534, Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had contact with the Moroccan slave Esteban Durantes before any contact with the remainder of survivors of his Spanish expedition. And as part of the Spanish Panfilo de Narvaez expedition, Esteban traveled from Florida in 1528 to what is now New Mexico in 1539 with a few other survivors. He is thought to have been killed by Zuni. More than a century later, when the Pueblos united to rid their homelands of the Spanish colonists during the 1690 Pueblo Revolt, one of the organizers of the revolt, Domingo Naranjo, was a Santa Clara Pueblo man of African ancestry. So he organized a revolt against the Spanish and fought on the side of the Native Americans. Let's see if it says anything what happened to him after he did that. We know what happened. In 1622, Algonquin Native Americans attacked the colony of Jamestown in Virginia. They massacred all the Europeans, but brought some of the few enslaved Africans as captives back to their own communities, gradually assimilating them. Interracial relationships continued to take place between Africans, which is later African Americans, and members of the Native American tribes in the coastal states. Although the colonists tried to enslave Native Americans in the early years, they abandoned the practice in the early 1800s. Several colonial advertisements for runaways made direct reference to the connection which Africans had in the Native American communities. Reward notices in colonial newspapers now told of African slaves who ran off with his Indian wife, or had kin among the Indians, or is part Indian and speaks their language good. Now we know that they had a hard time enslaving the Native Americans that were here because they knew the territory. They knew the land, they knew the territory. Now, what I want to say at this point is during that time or at that time, race was not a factor. It wasn't about what color your skin was so much. It's where you were from. There were some people, there were first people here who had dark skin, but they had not come up through the slave trade. And so they were welcome. The Africans that came through the slave trade, through the Ma'afa, the reason wasn't because of their skin color. It was a fact that they had come up through the slave trade. White superiority, or what they think is superiority, didn't come into the 18th century. So, until the late 18th century. So, in 1492, in the 1500s, and the 1600s, you had Black people that were already here, but they hadn't come up through the slave trade. And that was the difference in African slaves and Black people or people that were already here. Nothing to do with skin color. Not until later on in the 18th century. Now, several of the 13 colonies passed laws prohibiting the transportation of enslaved people into the frontier of the Cherokee Nation's territory to restrict interactions between the two groups. European colonists told the Cherokee that the smallpox epidemics of 1739 in the Southeast was due to disease brought by enslaved Africans. Now, some tribes encouraged intermarriage with Africans with the idea that stronger children would result from the unions. Look at that. Colonists in the South Carolina felt so concerned about the possible threat posed by the mixed African and Native American population that they passed a law in 1725 prohibiting taking enslaved people to the frontier regions and imposing a fine of 200 pounds if violated. In 1751, South Carolina passed a law against holding Africans in proximity to Native Americans, as the planters considered the detrimental to the security of the colony. Now, under Governor James Glenn, and he was in office from 1743 to 1756 in South Carolina, he promoted an official policy that aimed to create in Native American an aversion to African Americans in an attempt to thwart possible alliance between them. So they ain't want the enslaved Africans and the Native Americans to come together because that would just be too strong of a force for them to fight. Now, during 1753, during the chaos of Pontiac's War, a resident of Detroit observed that the native tribes revolting were killing any whites that came across, but were saving and caressing all the Negroes they take. I didn't know we had that many wars. We don't talk about any of these wars in school except the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, World War One, and World War Two. We don't talk about any of these other wars that took place, these smaller, I guess, wars that took place in the United States. And apparently there was a whole lot of them. Now, the resident expressed fear that this practice could eventually lead to an uprising amongst the enslaved people. Man, they will do anything to keep us from uprising. They will, oh my God. They really are afraid of us. They really are. As soon as we get together, it's over. Now, similarly, Iroquois chief, oh my goodness, the Yen de Nigea, more commonly known as Joseph Brant. You could have put that before that big word. Similarly, welcomed runaway slaves and encouraged them to intermarry in the tribe. The Native Americans' adoption system did not discriminate on the basis of color. They didn't discriminate on the basis of color. It wasn't a color thing. It was your status. What was your status? Were you enslaved? Were you free? At the beginning, the Indian villages would eventually serve as stations on the Underground Railroad. All right. Now, historian Carter G. Woodson believed that relations with Native American tribes could have provided an escape hatch from slavery. Native American villages welcomed fugitive slaves, and in the antebellum years, some served as stations on the Underground Railroad. There were varieties of attitude. Some Native Americans resented the presence of Africans. Again, it wasn't a color thing, it was where you were from. What is your status? Some of them resented the presence of Africans. And I'm sure that those ones that resented it became one of the five civilized tribes. In one account, the Catawba tribe in 1752 showed great anger and bitter resentment when an African American came to them as a trader, not traitor, trader, meaning he was trading some goods and things. European and European American colonists tried to divide Native Americans and African Americans against each other. Europeans considered both races inferior and tried to convince Native Americans that Africans worked against their best interests. Leave it to the colonizers to divide and conquer. All right, now in the colonial period, Native Americans received rewards if they returned formerly enslaved people who had escaped. In the latter 19th century, African American soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, had assignments to fight with the U.S. forces in Indian wars in the West. All right, European enslavement. European colonists, they created a new demand market for captives of raids when they founded what would go on to become the 13 colonies, especially in the South and the Southern colonies. Initially, they initially were developed for resources exploitation rather than for settlement. Colonists purchased or captured Native Americans to be used as forced labor in cultivating tobacco and by the 18th century, rice and indigo. So they were using Native Americans first. Remember, they did try to enslave them, and some of them they did. Again, it had nothing to do with that they didn't come through the Ma'afa. They were already here, and some of them were black. They just feel like they were inferior. Now, to acquire trade goods, Native Americans began selling war captives to whites rather than integrating them into their own societies. So they started to trade black bodies for goods. They traded goods, oh my goodness, Lord have mercy. They traded goods like axes, bronze kettles, Caribbean rum, European jewelry, needles, and scissors varied among the tribes, but the most prized were rifles. And that is the same thing that they did in Africa. They traded those things for bodies, for Black bodies. And they did the same thing here in the United States. Before the Ma'afa, or during at the beginning of the Ma'afa, they were trading Black bodies for these things. Mm. So the English copied the Spanish and the Portuguese. They saw the enslavement of Africans and Native Americans as a moral, legal, and socially acceptable institution. A common rationale for enslavement was the taking of captives after a just war and using slavery as an alternative to a death sentence. So basically, prisoners of war, they took prisoners of war, and instead of killing them, they enslaved them for life. Now, the escape of Native American slaves were frequent because they had a better understanding of the land. Remember, I told you they knew where they were going. Africans did not. Consequently, the natives who were captured and sold into slavery were often sent to the West Indies or far away from their traditional homeland. So now they're selling people from the United States to other places. Ooh, let me tell you about these colonizers. The oldest known record of a permanent Native American slave was a native man from Massachusetts in 1636. By 1661, slavery had become legal in all of the 13 colonies. Virginia would later declare Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes to be real estate. Notice they didn't say Africans. They said Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes to be real estate. In 1682, New York forbade in New wait a minute, and in eight hold on, get it together. And in 1682, New York forbade African or Native American slaves from leaving their master's home or plantation without permission. European colonists also viewed the enslavement of Native Americans differently than the enslavement of Africans in some cases. A belief that Africans were brutish people was dominant. While both Native Americans and Africans were considered savages, Native Americans were romanticized as noble people that could be elevated into Christian civilization. That was one of the criteria in order to make those tribes civilized tribes. It is estimated that Carolina traders operated out of Charlestown exported an estimated 30,000 to 51,000 Native American captives between 1670 and 1715 in a profitable slave trade with the Caribbean, the Spanish, Hispaniola, and northern colonies. It was more profitable to have Native American slaves because African slaves had to be shipped, purchased, while native slaves could be captured and immediately taken to plantations. Now, whites in the northern colonies sometimes preferred Native American slaves, especially the women and children, to the Africans because Native American women were agriculturists and children could be trained more easily. However, Carolinians had more of a preference for African slaves, but also capitalized on the Indian slave trade combining both. In about the 1700 records of slaves mixed with African and Native American heritage, and by the late 1700s, records of slaves mixed with African and Native American heritage were recorded. In the eastern colonies, it became common practice to enslave Native American women and African men with the parallel growth of enslavement for both Africans and Native Americans. This practice also led to a large number of unions between Africans and Native Americans. This practice of combining African slave men and Native American women was especially common in South Carolina. Now, during this time, records also show that many Native American women brought African men, but unknown to the European traders, the women freed and married the men into their tribe. So now you have Native American women and African men who have children. So these children that are Native American and part African, if they marry someone who is African, you're going to have a more of an African dominant gene. So that's why you have that lineage of Native American and Africans that are all mixed together. We're all mixed together. Let's see. The Indian Wars of the early 18th century, combined with the growing availability of African slaves, essentially ended the Indian slave trade by 1750. Numerous colonial slave traders had been killed in the fighting, and the remaining Native American groups banded together, more determined to face the Europeans from a position of strength rather than be enslaved. Though the Indian slave trade ended, the practice of enslaving Native Americans continued. Records from June 28, 1771 show Native American children were kept as slaves in Long Island, New York. Native Americans also married while enslaved, creating families both native and some of partial African descent. I just said that. Occasional mentioning of Native American slaves running away, being bought or sold along with Africans in newspapers is found throughout the later colonial period. And there are also many accounts of former slaves mentioning having a parent or a grandparent who was Native American or of partial descent. Man, I'll tell you what, apparently my brain is reading ahead of my eyes. Advertisements asked for the return of both African American and Native American slaves. Records and slave narratives obtained by the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration, clearly indicate that the enslavement of Native Americans continued in the 1800s, mostly through kidnappings. These bastards were still kidnapping folks. The abduction showed that even in the 1800s, little distinction was made between African Americans and Native Americans. So again, it had nothing to do with the color of our skin. It was where you were from or what your status was. Both Native American and African American slaves were at a risk of sexual abuse by slaveholders and other white men of power. During the transitional period of Africans becoming the primary race enslaved, Native Americans had been sometimes enslaved at the same time. Africans and Native Americans worked together. They lived together in communal quarters, along with white indentured servants, produced collective recipes for food, and shared herbal remedies, their myths, and their legends. Now, sometimes intermarried and had mixed race children. The exact number of Native Americans who were enslaved is unknown because vital statistics and census reports were at best infrequent. Among the Cherokee, interracial marriages or unions increased as the number of slaves held by the tribe increased. The Cherokee had a reputation for having slaves work side by side with their owners. The Cherokee resistance to the Euro American system of chattel slavery created tensions between them and the European Americans. The Cherokee tribe began to become divided as intermarriage between white men and Native women increased, and there was increased adoption of European culture. So did racial discrimination against those of African Cherokee blood and against African slaves. So these white men was marrying these indigenous Cherokee women and making them assimilate into their culture. The cultural assimilation among the tribes, particularly the Cherokee, created pressure to be accepted by European Americans. And after Indian slavery was ended in the colonies, some African men chose Native American women as their partners because their children would be born free. Ooh, okay. So during slavery, you know that well, if you don't know, you were born whatever the status of your mother was. So if your mother was free, then you were born free. Supposedly. Supposedly. Now you know them mofos got away with some shady stuff. But the men, African men, would marry Native American women so that their children would be born free. And beginning in 1662 in Virginia and soon followed by other colonies, they established a law known as, ooh Lord, as Partis Sequetur Vitrim. That said, let me see. That said, the child status followed that of the mother. Okay. Separately, according to the matrilineal system among many Native American tribes, children were considered to be born to and to belong to the mother's people. So were raised as Native American. Even though they had African blood, Because the mother was Native American, they were raised as Native American, which means they could have been blue black and raised Native American. Come on now. All right, so as European expansion increased in the Southeast, African and Native American marriages became more common. In the 1800s, throughout the Civil War. In the early 19th century, the U.S. government believed that some tribes had become extinct, especially on the East Coast. Wonder how come? Hmm. On the East Coast, where there had been a longer period of European settlement and where most Native Americans had lost their communal land. Had lost it? I don't think they lost it. I think they know exactly where it is. It was taken, it wasn't lost. They know where it is. A few reservations had been established and they were considered landless. And at that time, the government did not have a separate census designation for Native Americans. Those who remained among the European American communities were frequently listed as mulatto, a term applied to Native American white. Native American African and African white mixed race people, as well as triracial people. The Seminole people of Florida formed in the 18th century in what is called ethnogenesis from Muskogee Creek and Florida tribes. They incorporated some Africans who had escaped from slavery. And other Maroons formed separate communities near the Seminole and were allied with them in military actions. Now, such interracial or such intermarriages took place um, in those communities. African Americans living near the Seminole were called Black Seminole. Several hundred people of African descent traveled with the Seminole when they were removed to Indian Territory. Others stayed with the few hundred Seminoles who remained in Florida, undefeated by the Americans. By contrast, the 1835 census of the Cherokee showed that 10% were of African descent. In those years, census of the tribes classified people of mixed Native American and African descent as Native American. So you're going to find people of African descent listed as Native Americans. Now, during the registration of tribal members for the Dawes Roll, which preceded land allotment by individual heads of households of the tribes, generally the Cherokee freedmen were classified separately on a freedman roll. Registrars often work quickly, judging by appearance, without asking if the freedmen had Cherokee ancestry, which would have qualified them as Cherokee by blood, enlisting on those rolls, which would have given them land grants. Now we know that Black women can be blue black and can give birth to a child with blonde hair and blue eyes because we have the Eve gene and we can give birth to any color outside of ourselves. So they were going by appearance. If you was too dark, where in the world you were a Native American. This issue had caused problems for their descendants in the late 20th and 21st century. The nation passed legislation and a constitutional amendment to make membership more restrictive, open only to those with certificates of blood ancestry, with proven descent from Cherokee by blood. Individuals, Cherokee by blood, individuals on the Dawes Roll. Western frontier artist George Catlin described Negro and North American Indian mix of equal blood and stated they were the finest built and most powerful men he had ever seen. By 1922, John Swatton's survey of the 5 civilized tribes noted that half of the Cherokee nations consisted of freedmen and their descendants. Former slaves and Native Americans intermarried in northern states as well. In Massachusetts was a vital records. Their vital records prior to 1850 included notes of marriages of Negroes to Indians. By 1860, in some areas of the South where race was considered binary of black, mostly enslaved, or white legislators thought the Native Americans no longer qualified as Native Americans, as many were mixed and part black. They did not recognize that many mixed race Native Americans identified as Indian by culture and family. Legislators wanted to revoke the Native American tax exemption. And freed African Americans, Black Indians, and Native Americans fought in the American Civil War against the Confederate Army. During 1861 in November, the Muskogee Creek and Black Indians, led by Creek Chief, I'm not going to say his name because I can't say it, they fought three pitched battles against Confederate whites and allied Native Americans to reach the Union lines in Kansas, and they offered their services. Now, some Black Indians served in the colored regiments, and other African American soldiers did too. Black Indians were documented in the following regiments: the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, the Kansas Colored at Honey Springs, the 79th U.S. Colored Infantry, and the 83rd U.S. Colored Infantry, along with other colored regiments that included men listed as Negroes. Some Civil War battles occurred in Indian Territory. The first battle in Indian Territory took place July 1st and the 2nd in 1863, and Union forces included the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. The first battle against the Confederacy outside Indian Territory occurred at Horsehead Creek. It was in Arkansas, and that was on February 17, 1864. It was the 79th U.S. Colored Infantry that participated. Many Black Indians returned to Indian Territory after the Civil War had been won by the Union. When the Confederacy and its Native American allies were defeated, the U.S. required new peace treaties with the five civilized tribes, requiring them to emancipate slaves and to make those who chose to stay with the tribe full citizens of their nations with equal rights in annuities and land allotments. The former slaves were called freedmen, as in Cherokee freedmen, Chickasaw freedmen, Choctaw freedmen, Creek freedmen, and Seminole freedmen. The pro Union branch of the Cherokee government had freed their slaves in 1863, before the end of the war. The pro Confederacy Cherokee held their slaves until they were forced to emancipate them. Slavery had existed among the Native Americans as a way to make use of war captives before it was introduced by the Europeans. It was not the same as the European style of chattel slavery, in which slaves were accounted as personal property of a master. In Cherokee oral traditions, they enslaved war captives, and it was a temporary status pending adoption into a family or clan, or they were released. Now, Africa had similar slavery. They were war captives among the nations that were warring, and it was not chattel slavery. Those that they had enslaved sometimes were called indentured. Excuse me. And they could assimilate into the family. They could marry into the family. So it was different from chattel slavery. Now, what I'm trying to figure out is it says slavery had existed among Native Americans as a way to make use of war captives before it was introduced by the Europeans. So, who were they enslaving? Were they enslaving other Native Americans? Or were they enslaving the Africans that came here and settled here before the Ma'afa? The Cherokee tribe had the most members who held black slaves. Oh, so it says the Cherokee tribe had the most members who held black slaves, more than any other Native American tribe. Oh, there we go. There were the black slaves. Records from the slavery period show several cases of brutal Native American treatment of black slaves. However, most Native Americans' masters rejected the worst features of Southern practices. Federal Agent Hawkins considered the form of slavery as practiced by the Southern tribes to be inefficient because the majority didn't practice chattel slavery. Travelers reported enslaved Africans in as good circumstances as their masters. So, again, if they started to practice slavery before the Europeans introduced chattel slavery and they were enslaved Africans, that proves that Africans were here before the slave trade. A white Indian agent, Douglas Cooper, upset by the Native American failure to practice more severe rules, insisted that Native Americans invite white men to live in their villages and control matters, in quotation. So they wanted them to hire some overseers to get their, enslaved people in line. Though less than 3% of Native Americans owned slaves, which is a good thing, the fact of a racial caste system and bondage and pressure from European American culture created destructive cleavages in their villages. Some already had a class hierarchy based on white blood. Now we're coming in with the caste system. Now we're coming in with the color of your skin. In part because Native Americans of mixed race sometimes had stronger networks with traders for goods that they wanted. Among some bands, Native Americans of mixed white blood stood at the top. Pure Native Americans next, and people of African descent were at the bottom. Some of the status of partial white descent may have been related to the economic and social capital passed on by white relations. Members of the Native American groups held numerous African American slaves throughout the Civil War. Some of these slaves later recounted their lives for a WPA oral history project during the Great Depression in the 1930s. After the Civil War in 1866, the United States government required new treaties with the five civilized tribes, who each had major factions allied with the Confederacy. They were required to emancipate their slaves and grant them citizenship and membership into their respective tribes. And as the United States freed slaves and granted them citizenships by amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Now, these people were known as freedmen, for instance, um, Muskogee or Cherokee. Some Maroon communities allied with the Seminole in Florida and intermarried. The Black Seminole included those with and without Native American ancestry. Let's see. So this is kind of repetitive talking about it, but I wanted to just talk about how we got to Black Native Americans and why they're not recognized. Well, we know why they're not recognized, but why they're not recognized, and that they're still fighting for land that truly belongs to them. All right, I want to read a little bit about this. It talks about genealogy and genetics. Um, African Americans looking to trace their genealogy can face many difficulties. While a number of Native American nations are better documented than the white communities of the era, the destruction of family ties and family records during the human trafficking of the Atlantic slave trade has made tracking African American family lines much more difficult. In Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage, William Katz writes that the number of Black Indians among the Native American nations were understood by hundreds of thousands, and by that comparing by comparing pictorial documentation to verbal and written accounts, it is clear that Black Indians existed in these settings, but were often simply not remarked upon or recorded by white chroniclers of the era. Enslaved Africans were renamed by those who enslaved them, and until after the American Civil War, they were usually not even provided with surnames. Similarly, historical records with genealogists usually rely upon, such as like census, they did not record the names of enslaved African Americans before the Civil War. While some major slavers kept extensive records, which historians and genealogists have used to create family trees, researchers generally find it difficult to trace the history of African American families before the Civil War. Enslaved people were also forbidden to learn to read and write, and harshly punished or even killed if they defied this ban, making records kept by families themselves extremely rare. Um, it says that some family members have tried to keep oral histories of the family, but due to many challenges listed that were listed above, these accounts have always not always have been reliable. And knowing the family's geographic origins may help individuals know where to start in piecing together their genealogy. Working from oral history, existing records, descendants can try to confirm stories of more precise African origins, as well as those of any possible native ancestry through genealogical research and even DNA testing. However, DNA cannot reliably indicate Native American ancestry, and no DNA test can indicate tribal origin. That's for Native American. For African, you can. You can do a DNA test and it will take you right back to the nation that you are from. Let's see. So, um, yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about uh, what exactly is a Black Indian. What exactly is indigenous African indigenous person? How did they get to be that? What makes them an Indian? How did they commingle and intermarry and things of that nature? All right, and I wanted to read this. This is some information that I took about Native American spirituality. And I want you to listen to this. And I want you to see the great similarities between this and African spirituality, because it ain't much difference. Native American spirituality is deeply rooted in the concept of interconnectedness, all living things on earth. They view the natural world as sacred and consider themselves part of a larger web of life, and often referring it to a great spirit as the creator, honoring spirits within animals, plants, and even inanimate objects through rituals and ceremonies that reflect a deep respect for the land and its bounty. This is often described as animism. Everything, everything possesses spirit. The Great Spirit. And most tribes believe in a supreme being. They call it the Great Spirit or the Creator, who is responsible for all creation and is seen as a benevolent force. Mother Earth. The Earth is considered a living entity, often referred to as Mother Earth, and is revered for providing sustenance and life. Animal spirits. Many tribes believe that animals possess spirits which can provide guidance and power, with individuals often having a personal spiritual animal. Vision quest. Seeking a spiritual insight through solitary experiences in nature, often involving fasting and meditation to receive visions or messages from spirit beings. Ceremonies and rituals. Sacred ceremonies are conducted to mark important life events like birth, coming of age, marriage, and death, often involving prayer, singing, dancing, and the use of sacred objects. Medicine people. Spiritual leaders, sometimes called shamans, who act as healers and interpreters of the spirit world, guiding others through ceremonies and providing guidance. There is diversity within the tribes. While there are common threads, Native American spirituality varies greatly between different tribes with unique beliefs and practices. Central tenet of Native American spirituality is the responsibility to care for and live in harmony with the natural world. Oral traditions. Most Native American spiritual knowledge is passed down through oral storytelling and teachings from elders. Spirit indwells in everything. They're connected with humans to other gifts and wisdom. Evil deities were responsible for suffering, disasters, and death. Creation stories cover the origins of the world and the particular tribes and humans' relationships to the world and the creator or creators. The spirituality of Black Native Americans. They're often referred to as Afro Indigenous or Black and Native. A complex blend of beliefs drawing both from African and Native American traditions, often centered around a deep connection again to nature, reverence for ancestors, and a belief in the interconnectedness of all living things with a strong emphasis on gratitude and the respect for the earth. This can include practices like honoring spirits associated with specific animals, plants, and land, as well as incorporating elements of ancestral rituals and storytelling from both lineages. Like many Native American cultures, Black Native Americans often view themselves as part of the natural world. They respect and honor the spirits of animals, plants, and land. Both African and Native American traditions place great importance on connecting and honoring their ancestors, often seeking guidance and strength from their spirits. Spirituality through ceremony and ritual. Traditional practices such as prayer, drumming, singing, and sacred dances can be used to connect with the spiritual realm. The concept of Wakan or great mystery. This concept, common, common across many Native American tribes, refers to a universal spiritual power that permeates all creation. Integration of African spiritual elements. Some Black Native Americans can incorporate aspects of African spirituality, like honoring the Orisha deities or practices related to hoodoo, depending on their specific lineage and cultural connection. Just like with any large population, there are significant variations in spiritual beliefs and practices among Black Native Americans, depending on their specific tribe affiliation. Historical trauma and forced assimilation can affect how Black Native Americans practice their spirituality. Many Black Native Americans actively seek to reconnect with their indigenous heritage in spiritual practices throughout research, community connections, and cultural revitalization efforts. All right, the practice of enslaving Africans was not a traditional Native American custom, but it was largely adopted after sustained contact with European colonizers who brought the concept of chattel slavery to the Americas. Yep, because if you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. So that's what happened. We laid down with the, yeah. Mhm. As European settlers demanded more agricultural products like cotton, some Native American tribes saw enslaved Africans as a labor force to meet their demands and maintain their land ownership. Owning slaves was also a way for certain Native American leaders to enhance their social status and gain recognition among other tribes and the colonizing powers. An intermarriage between Native Americans and enslaved Africans created a mixed race population that further complicated the dynamics of slave ownership within these tribes. And so um, that's it for tonight. I just wanted to read that just so we could get an idea of our Black, wonderful, indigenous, native, um, Afro indigenous ancestors and how you you don't see them in mainstream media. You still see the white natives or the reddish, brown, reddish natives, or you'll see, yeah, white. You'll see white natives. You'll mostly see white ones. Uh, you don't see too many, but it's a lot of Afro Indigenous people out there. It's a lot. Down here in the 757, we have a lot. We have a lot of Afro Indigenous people. I have quite a few friends that are Afro Indigenous. But for those of you who know your history, I applaud you. For those of us who are still looking, keep asking, asking questions of the oldest person in your family. If you've been told that you have Indian in your family, try to find out what nation you're from. All right, so that is it for tonight. I'm a little tired. I had kids this morning. I had pre-K. I had two classes this morning, so they wore me out. But you know the drill. Love yourself, love each other, give yourself some grace, give each other some grace. Stay cool, stay hot wherever you are. Honor your ancestors, they will honor you. We are our ancestors. Until next time, family, stay Black. Peace.